Great. Thanks, Brooklyn. Good deal. Got your recording and everything. Awesome. So, welcome. I'm glad to be with you guys today. As Brooklyn said, my name's Robyn. I'm the County Extension Coordinator and Ag Agent here in Lincoln County. I've been here since 2019, but my background is actually primarily in livestock. So, horses, cattle, chickens, sheep, goats, kind of that nature of things. But what you learn as county agent is that we are jacks of all trades. And when I first started in Extension, a lot of the questions I got early on were related to pecan management, and specifically kind of small operations, backyard, homeowner type questions. And so I got pretty good pretty quick at it, and that snowballed into developing what we now call the East Georgia Pecan Workshop that we have every year. We do that more on a commercial scale. It's actually grown kind of beyond the original backyard folks that we intended it for, but we kind of saw that need and have snowballed some things. So it's been a really great time to learn about backyard and homeowner pecans and about some of the commercial things as well. And I'm looking forward to kind of visiting with you guys today. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, but that's a little bit of how I got here. I will say I am not a pecan expert by any means. I know enough to be dangerous. I can probably answer most of the homeowner backyard type questions, but there are times when I may refer you to let me know and let me reach out to our area pecan agent or our statewide specialist, just because those are really the folks that keep the wheels turning for some of this. But I'm going to go ahead and share here. Brooklyn, you see that okay?
That looks good.
Perfect. I want to clarify a few things too before I get started. I'm going to call this home pecans. You can call it backyard, you can call it small scale. The terminology doesn't really matter, but we're talking about folks who are not producing on a commercial scale, right? So there are some limitations with that, and we're going to talk about those as we go through. The other component that I wanted to mention is that you'll notice I may or may not interchange pecan and pecan. I don't know if you can tell, I'm not from the South originally, and I know we've got some heated debate on what term is correct. I was told that it's a pecan pie, but it's a pecan tree. So for the most part, I'm going to use pecan, but if we have some arguments in the chat, I'm not going to be upset to see your logic either. When we talk about home or backyard production, the other thing that I think is important just to think about is that we're going to have a broad scale of people and operation here, right? So you might be somebody who has maybe 2 or 3 trees that are older that you're just trying to kind of manage a little bit better. Or sometimes I have folks that have, maybe they've got 5 or 6 acres of trees that they're just trying to do a better job with. So when I give this talk, it's usually a little bit broad. I'm going to give some kind of overarching ideas, but the reason for that is that everybody's coming from a different place and a different experience level and a different scale of what they're doing, even under this kind of small production umbrella. So just be mindful of that. I'm happy to go into more depth on things or help connect you with resources if you need something that I don't cover as much as you want today. I also want to give a nod to our area pecan agent, Andrew Sawyer. He sent me some of the content and slides that are in here today, so I appreciate him making my life easy. So what we're going to talk about today, we're going to go through some of the factors that influence pecan production. So some of the things that we need to be thinking about from a how do we actually get the trees to bear nuts. And then we're going to talk about the most common issues and calls that I get from pecan people. And then I'm going to give you just a rough management calendar that we actually are currently working on having published through the university that is designed for small production or backyard operations. So it's not completely finished yet, but I wanted to at least give you what we do have so that you can have kind of some guidance throughout the year of how to manage. So first and foremost, what influences pecan production, right? The number one thing when we talk commercial standpoint is tree variety. There are tons and tons of different varieties of pecans out there, or cultivars, what we might call them. And a lot of times in commercial operations, we are using specific cultivars for specific purposes. In a home situation or a backyard situation, the variety may or may not be quite as important because our ability to control it is different. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But the variety does matter for a couple of different things. Water and irrigation is also critically important. So obviously our trees need water just for normal function, but the actual development of that nut, or what we call the nut fill in the shell, is directly related to irrigation and water availability. Again, we're going to go into each of these a little bit more in depth, but that's something that's also really important for our production. Then we have things like pollination, so making sure our trees are oriented in the right space, that we have enough pollinators for the trees that we have, sunlight, fertility, insect and disease, obviously. So there's a bunch of things that play into how successfully we can produce. Some of these things you're going to have a lot of control over, right? So we can control what varieties we plant, we can control our fertility plan. We can't really control the environment, right? We can't really control our soil texture or the weather or the rainfall or things like that. So some of these things are a little bit harder to manage than others. So as I said, we're going to walk through each of those pieces a little more in depth. So talking about variety, as I said, this is just the cultivar or the type of tree that you have. The cultivar or variety is really just going to influence the quality of the nut you have, the fertility that that tree needs. Some of the growth habit is also influenced. So whether that tree grows more kind of branching or more straight up, that's going to be based on cultivar and pruning. But the biggest and most important part of the variety conversation from a homeowner or a small production standpoint is that disease resistance. We want trees that are going to have the best shot at producing nuts for us. And if we are planting new trees, we need to be planting disease-resistant trees. We're going to talk later about some of the disease that we see, the most common one we see, and also some insect issues we might see. And both of those problems can be significantly reduced by planting resistant varieties. Now, if you're a backyard producer, you may not have that ability, right? You may have some old Elliots or Stewarts or some variety that it's a 60-year-old tree and you don't have any option on the variety, and that's totally okay. You just got to work with what you got. But if we are thinking about planting new trees, that is going to be a big consideration. So as I said, selection of that variety matters. If you have existing trees, hopefully you know what they are. If not, I hate to break it to you, it's dang near impossible to tell. Most of our varieties are very, very similar in how they look and how their leaves and nuts appear. Mr. Lenny Wells, who is our state pecan specialist, might be able to ID it if you get him enough good pictures of that tree. But for the majority of us, we are not going to be able to ID what type of pecan tree you have. Especially if it's an older mature tree. As I said, if you're going to be planting new trees, whether that is starting an entire new orchard or maybe you're just renovating, so as you have some of those older trees come down or get pulled out of your orchard, you're replacing them, you need to be thinking about that low input or disease and insect resistant tree. Typically, the varieties that we recommend right now are going to be things like Avalon, Excel, Kanza, and Lakota. Each of those do have some different characteristics in terms of nut bearing and things like that, but for the most part, we're looking for the most low input possible. That means that it's going to take less investment of fertilizer and pesticides to get your crop, essentially. The other thing we think about is layout and pollinator trees. I'm not going to talk a whole lot about that, but that is something that becomes really important, especially if you're renovating or doing a new planting. So as I said, layout and pruning, there's a lot of ways to lay out an orchard. And again, in the homeowner or backyard situation, it's going to look a lot different. So on a commercial scale, they put them in a grid, usually like a 60 or 80-foot grid. We may not follow that in a backyard situation for a lot of different reasons. But we want to be thinking of the mature tree size. So what variety are we using? How large are they going to get? We're going to think about the equipment that we might need to get in and out of that orchard. And we're thinking about pollination because pecan trees do require pollination in order to produce those nuts. So if you have poor fruit in your orchard, especially if it's an older orchard, you may want to consider adding some additional pollinator trees in there. I believe we say it's 1 pollinator tree per 8 mature pecan producing trees, but I would have to double check that, and we can certainly get you more information on that. Pruning is also really critical for tree development, especially generally we're talking about the first 3 to 5 years of making sure that we are getting the correct shape for that tree to be bearing our nuts effectively. There's a great article about it. I'll drop in the chat at the end of the talk so that you can access it. I'm not going to go real deep into it, but I did also ask our pecan specialist if we could kind of top pecan trees, because a lot of times pruning in a commercial standpoint, they're going to be pruning for those trees to be very, very tall and for those branching scaffolding limbs to be very high up off the ground so that they can get their equipment underneath for things like harvest and weed control and things like that. In a homeowner situation, we don't necessarily want the tallest trees we can get, right? We want trees that are accessible to us. And he did say that if we wanted to, we can do some topping is what we would call it, and we can remove some of that central leader, or if you see in that photo on that right, it has a very nice straight tall central branch. We can top that and chop the top part of it off and kind of limit that tree's height. Now we can't just completely change it a 60-foot tree to a 10-foot tree. That's not ever going to happen, but we can do a little bit on the pruning side to maybe make them a little bit more manageable for a homeowner standpoint. But proper pruning to make sure that we're getting that tree to branch the way we want it for later production. And again, that's usually in your first 3 to 5 years or so. The next thing I mentioned is water. Irrigation is the #1 thing you can do if you are trying to improve your nut production on a home or backyard scale. Irrigation is going to influence, again, the nut size and the quality, so the fill of the nut in that shell. It means the tree is going to actually hold on to that nut a little bit longer on the tree, which means more energy put into it. It reduces the issues with shelling and with shucking, and also reduces alternate bearing, which we'll talk a little bit more later. But basically, it is going to benefit your nuts. There is not a single downfall to adding water to your system if you have the ability to. The downfall to this is that on a backyard scale, this gets pretty tough to do. Pecans need around 60 inches of rain per year, and the greatest demand for that is from August to September. And at that standpoint, you're going to need roughly 3,600 to 4,000 acres per acre, or gallons per acre per day, which is a lot of water. You can't do that on a normal household well. You can't do it if you're doing it off of city water or something like that. So you would need to either drill a well for irrigation for your orchard. You can use surface water. So if you've got a big enough surface water body that you can pull from, that can work. The only dilemma with surface water is that you do need to have appropriate filtration in that system, because pulling from a surface water source, you have a lot more debris, you've got plant matter, you've got all kinds of things in it. And typically with irrigation, we are going to be doing either drip lines or an emitter like the one in the photo. And if you get any kind of debris in that line, it destroys the system. So if you do a surface water, you need to make sure that we're doing the right filtration processes to make it effective as an irrigation water source. If you can't irrigate, and I would argue most backyard or homeowners cannot, you just got to take what you get. Some years you're going to have better rainfall, better harvest. Other years you're going to have worse. There's really not a whole lot you can do about it. But if you want to come away from this talk of what's the one thing that you can do as an investment into your orchard to improve your nuts, it's going to be irrigation if you don't have it. Another thing we think about is fertility. I know Brooklyn mentioned that she has done a soil testing talk with you, so hopefully you've heard some about soil chemistry and fertility and nutrients. But we want our trees to have the best fertility possible so that they can grow most effectively, but also so that they can produce most effectively. The best option here is to take a soil test. That's going to be for pH and your major micronutrients, your phosphorus, potassium, things like that. The other thing with pecans that's very important is zinc. And so in order to evaluate zinc, we actually do what's called a leaf test or a tissue test. So we would pull leaves off of the tree, send them to the lab, and get an actual report back on what the zinc content in that leaf was. Unfortunately, the zinc content in your soil is not always reflective of what is actually taken up by the tree. So we do those two tests in conjunction to kind of get the best answer that we can. Now, if you don't want to bother with the soil or leaf test, and that's fine, I get it, we can do just kind of a general fertility plan that we would recommend. And that's going to be 25 pounds of a 10-10-10 fertilizer in March or so. That is just broadcast around the under the canopy of that tree, and then we would do 4 pounds of zinc sulfate per tree as well. And that would cover most of our nutrient gaps as long as we didn't have some like really wonky thing happening in your soil. So I always recommend a soil test first and foremost, but if you want to take the shortcut, that's kind of our best guidance on what most mature trees need in order to meet their nutrition and fertility needs. When it comes to harvest, typically we're looking anywhere from September to November, depending on where you are in the state. We do want those nuts to fall off the tree and be fully mature before we collect them. I do recommend that you mow that area before you harvest. So sometimes, typically, I would say it depends on when you have the most nut fall. And again, some of that's related to weather and environment and water. It's not always super consistent, but we want to make sure that we are mowing kind of right before harvest because that's going to make your collection of your nuts a lot easier. When we start seeing production, typically we're looking at trees that are from 3 to 8 years old is when they start actually bearing nuts. It depends on the variety. Some start sooner, some start later. Again, different stress events. So for example, when you first plant your pecan trees, we recommend that you remove about 1/3 of the tree when they go in the ground off the top. And what that does is it gives the root system time to develop without having to feed more limbs than what it can sustain. So let's say that you didn't do that, that you just bought a pecan sapling, threw it in the ground, called it good. That tree might take an extra year or two to bear fruit because it had to invest the energy in growing both its upper pieces, its trunk and its branches and leaves, as well as its root system instead of just working on the root system that first year. So typically harvest anywhere from 3 to 8 years old. They will continue to produce for a long, long time, but they don't produce forever. So sometimes I get a call of, well, my tree is not producing anymore, and they'll say, well, it's like 80 years old. And they don't produce forever. They will still try, but they won't do a good job. And unfortunately, when you start hitting 60, 80-year-old trees, you can do all of the management things in this talk to try to help, but we're probably not going to get those trees to be much more productive than they are, right? They're old, they've run their course, they're on the way out. In terms of harvest, for backyard or homeowner, depending on how much you have, we have the nut broom collector wheels. Those are just the metal kind of rolling things that will pick up nuts for you. And then there's also some different systems available that you can purchase that are more mechanized for harvest. And when you do harvest, make sure that you're only keeping the ones that have intact brown shells. If they are green or if they're cracked or obviously damaged or black, those are not shells that we're going to want to keep. Those are not nuts that we're going to want to keep. So harvest itself, I know most of the people in my area use the wheel roller to pick up theirs, but there are some other options. Unfortunately, for most of our homeowner and backyard, the expense of purchasing an actual harvesting machine is so large that it's just never going to be economically feasible for you to do. So we're stuck with kind of the old school ways. Once you do harvest, there's 2 things you can do. If you want to keep the shells intact, so the nuts full and intact, you can go ahead and keep those cool and dry. So like a root cellar or a basement or somewhere like that is going to be a good option for storage. They do keep for about a year, and you should be able to keep them like that, no issue. If you want to shell those nuts, you can do that as well. Typically, when we're shelling, we're going to make sure the nuts are dry first because if they have extra moisture, that's going to cause them to go rancid more quickly. And then you can store them at room temperature for about 3 months or so. They do have a lot of oil, so they do tend to go rancid pretty quickly. Or you can put them in like a Ziploc bag in the freezer and they'll last about a year again. So either of those options work. I know that there are some places across the state that there are commercial processors who will shell your nuts for you. You would have to look into the economics of that, of is it worth the expense of doing it that way versus shelling them yourself. I really don't have a great answer there, but that is sometimes something I get asked. So I'm going to pause here. Do we have any questions on kind of the general management? Okay. Feel free to drop it if you do, but I'm going to just keep rolling otherwise. As a county agent, I get calls about pecans fairly regularly, and here are some of the things that I get asked about. Nut drop is one. We get asked about alternate bearing, disease, insect, and then from a standpoint of other issues that we might see are things like lack of irrigation or shade. As I said, some of these we can do things about, some of these we can't, but I'm going to walk through kind of what my county agent response would be to each of these and maybe what you can do about it. So nut drop is a normal occurrence. There are usually 4 of these in the year. Sometimes they're worse than others. So occasionally I'll get a phone call and a client will say, well, my pecan tree lost half its nuts overnight. What happened? Why did it do that? What's wrong with it? If it's in one of these windows, so right after pollination, June, July, August, it may be completely normal. It can be related to a lot of different things. So sometimes it's a water issue. So if we get too much water, it'll actually cause those nuts to develop too quickly. If we have development issues, so like the endosperm or the embryo development, that can also impact nut drop. And then if we have an insect pest issue, that can cause nut drop. But if it's kind of in one of these time frames of June, July, August, and right after pollination, a lot of times it is just kind of a normal occurrence. There's nothing you can do about it. It's just going to happen. Some years it is worse than others, but this is normal. We expect it, not a big deal. The only thing I would say is make sure you take a look at some of those nuts and at the trees themselves. If you see any evidence of insect activity or insect damage, then that is something that we might want to talk about. But for the most part, if you just see the nuts and there's no obvious reason for it, usually it's just a normal nut drop. Another thing I find people don't always know is that pecans are what we call alternate bearing, which means they follow a 2-year cycle of production. So they're going to produce a lot of nuts one year, and then the following year they're going to kind of produce very little. They're going to use that year to recuperate their energy stores and then produce really heavily the 3rd year. So kind of every other year you should have a heavier harvest than the year before. Again, this is influenced by the variety you have. So some cultivars do this worse than others. Some of it is related to environment, to the weather. A stressed tree is going to act very differently than one that's healthy. Your management matters. Following the guidelines in terms of fertility and in terms of pruning and things like that can help reduce alternate bearing. And the other thing that we do on a commercial level that we would probably not do very much at a home level is nut thinning. So on a commercial level, they go through early in the season and they actually shake the trees and remove about 60% of the nuts on them. And that actually allows the remaining nuts on the tree to have more resources to develop better and to produce better quality nuts. And it means that the following year, the alternate year, is less affected. So it means that they have more consistent production year to year. Again, we don't really have the ability to do that on a homeowner scale. So unfortunately, it's one of those things we're kind of got to take what you can get. But it is normal. So if you have a year where they bear really heavy, you get a ton of pecans, and the next year there's not very many, that's normal. There's probably nothing wrong with the tree. It's probably just a normal occurrence. So those are the 2 normal things that happen. We're going to get into the not normal things. I shouldn't say not normal. These are still normal occurring things, but they are things that are a little bit more of a concern to us in terms of production. I'm not going to talk a lot about disease. The only disease I really want you guys to know about is scab. It is the #1 issue that I get called about on home or backyard trees. And most of the time it is in a old experience, like an older variety. Something like a Stewart would have a lot of scab issues. Pecan scab is a fungal disease, so it is a fungus that is attacking that tree, and it causes black lesions basically on the whole tree. So you'll get it on the nuts, on the leaves, on the twigs, kind of everywhere, and it gets worse with time, and it will travel from tree to tree. So typically, if you have scab on a tree, you have it on all of them. Pecan scab is going to cause poor nut development, small nuts. You'll get more aggressive nut drop sometimes because of it. And this is something that overwinters, so it comes back every single year. It's a recurring issue. Once you have scab, It's dang near impossible to get rid of, unfortunately. And it is something that the nut quality is so poor, you're really not going to do anything with them. So you're not going to want to harvest these, you're not going to want to eat them, anything like that. So what do we do? I hate to break it to you, there's really nothing you can do. The best option we have is planting resistant cultivars, as I said. So if you're planting new trees, getting trees that are resistant to this disease. And there are some things in terms of if you notice this early, we can do some management by removing all of the affected material. So if you prune all of the affected foliage and the limbs and things like that, you've got to remove it off of the orchard entirely, get it out of the vicinity of those trees. You can slow the spread. Typically, you're not going to get rid of it entirely. It's going to still be an issue, but you can try to slow it some. And then again, kind of that proper tree spacing, making sure that they are pruned correctly. That allows the sunlight and the airflow into that tree. That helps prevent the fungus from being quite as aggressive. But again, unfortunately, this really is not something that a homeowner has much agency to do anything with. There are fungicide treatments. So on the commercial end of things, we do have scab in commercial pecan orchards. They get on a fungicide program that starts at bud break is what we call it. It starts early in the season, and they will spray basically every 10 to 14 days through the entire growing season. So they may spray 12 or 15 times, depending on the cultivar, to manage this disease in a commercial orchard. You do have some access to some fungicides that claim to treat scab, but the problem is the correct application of those fungicides requires that you get the spray all the way up into the very tippy top of the canopy of those trees. And if you have a grown mature pecan tree that's 50 feet tall, you're not going to have the ability to do that without an air blast sprayer, which is like in the picture here. So if you're somebody maybe with a couple of acres, or maybe you have enough trees that looking into that is something that's an option for you, then that would be a great investment. But the reality is most people with 2, 3, 5, 10 trees don't have the economic ability to buy that type of equipment and use it to control scab. So really, unfortunately, it's something that we can do some on the management end, but from a fungicide standpoint, it's not something that we're going to really recommend for homeowners or backyard folks to do. So trying to plant the resistant cultivars, trying to prune out infected material, that's going to be your best bet. We also have insects that'll affect pecans. There are quite a few of these. Again, these are some of the most common. I'm sure I missed some, but these are insects that'll cause problems. So we have the pecan nut case bearer. This is a caterpillar. It causes feeding damage on the developing nuts. We have pecan bud moth. It's another caterpillar. Damages the buds, shoots, and leaves. You'll see a trend here. There's lots of caterpillars. We've got phylloxera. This is one that Brooklyn and I also saw in both of our counties this year that I had not seen in the last 4 years, but it causes these kind of interesting galls on the tree, and it is actually caused by aphid feeding, so it's one that is not caused by caterpillars. Those phylloxera can be controlled with some imidacloprid, which is an insecticide. The thing with phylloxera is that because it causes the galls or the lesions on the tree, the hickory shuckworm, which is a moth species, actually wants to lay its eggs in those galls. So if you have a phylloxera issue, a lot of times you'll also have a hickory shuckworm issue. So just being mindful, those two usually come together. Not super common, but they do occur. And then we have pecan weevils. This is one I see relatively frequently in homeowner stuff. You'll have shells that have a single little hole coming out of them and no nut inside. Typically, weevils can be controlled just with something like a 7 application around the trunk. You do need to be mindful every time it rains, that treatment basically goes away, so you've got to repeat it every time it rains. And then the last one we have are ambrosia beetles. These are only going to attack young trees, so 1 to 3 years old. You'll get these kind of very characteristic holes with kind of sawdust coming out of them early in the season, so February to May. And I'll send these slides out. for you guys to look at and see. I didn't want to spend a whole lot of time on insects just because there's something that, again, we'll talk here in a second. Um, if we have suspected insects in our pecans, we've got to confirm what the issue is first. And I'll say a lot of the challenge for us in extension is that by the time I get a call that there's a problem with a pecan tree, it is almost always past a point of us being able to do very much about it. So it's something where we've got really aggressive scab that's affecting the whole tree, or we've got really bad phylloxera that's already damaged all of the nuts for the season. And unfortunately, when you come to me at that point, there's really nothing I can recommend that's going to solve your problem. So make sure that we're ahead of it. We call that trapping and scouting usually, of just keeping an eye on your trees, seeing what's going on with them. We want to make sure that we are confirming what pest or disease we have, right? We don't want to make assumptions about what we think we have. We want to make sure we confirm it. Now, you can bring that to your county agent. You can bring it to me, whatever is easy for you, and we will do our best to help get you answers and get you a solution to that problem. Most of our insect pests can be managed with some insecticides. So I mentioned a couple of those. We have 7 for our weevils, we have imidacloprid for our phylloxera. For all of our caterpillar type pests, we would use a insecticide that's like a growth regulator. That works just fine. We have the same issue with pests that we do with scab, that if you have an insect pest in a mature tree, so a large tree, it is very difficult for you to apply that insecticide in the correct way. Again, if we need to have contact with those insects all the way up in the tallest branches. We are not able to do that in a backyard. Now, what we do know is some of these pests really only attack those young trees. So like our ambrosia beetles are looking at 1 to 3-year-old trees, which are usually small enough that we can spray them with just like a backpack sprayer, and we can manage that pest. So just be mindful, some of this relates to tree age. Most of our mature trees we won't have as much luck with, but again, identify that pest. And it's also that usually we need recurring treatments, and that's for any disease or pest. They don't just go away. Here in Georgia, we tend to have multiple life cycles of different insect pests and diseases. So if you treat them once, they won't necessarily go away just because you treated them once. We may have to be using that insecticide once every 2 weeks or so to manage that issue. So a lot of disease and insect management really comes down to working with us, working with Extension or whoever you trust to develop the appropriate program for the issue that you're having and for the life cycle of it, right? So that's just, I hate to say, we've got very minimal things we can do in a home orchard on those two, but they are things that we do see, that we do get calls about, and that we do want to keep in mind. Do we have any questions at this point? Okay, we have one here. Organic options. Unfortunately, there's really none. Some of the management type things, so again, kind of on the scab end, on the disease end, it's going to be, can we go ahead all of the infected material every time you see it? That's really your only option on a scab issue. Again, things like 7 might be useful on some of our insects, but bacterial BT, I can never say the second word. Brooklyn, do you know that second word? BT is a option that we can use for caterpillars, but again, it kind of all comes down to, can you get the application throughout the entire tree is the number one concern, and then is it actually going to affect the pest? So we don't really have great organic options in pecans, unfortunately. I hate to say that there's just not great options. Now, if you have a specific pest that you're concerned about, you can certainly visit with Brooklyn or myself, or we can put you in touch with Andrew Sawyer, who's our pecan agent, and we may be able to come up with some other ideas in terms of kind of orchard management that we can do. But unfortunately, we do rely pretty heavily on some of our fungicides and insecticides to really do what we need to do on the pecan end. So, hate to say, not a good option there. Anything else at this point? Okay, we're getting kind of to the end, and I'm not gonna necessarily hardcore read this to you, but this is the management calendar I recommended. As I said, we're working on getting this through as a UGA publication, so it's not official yet, but here are some of the things that we recommend based on time of year for you to be thinking about and doing. So in January and February, we are doing general orchard upkeep. So things like cleaning up the orchard, taking care of our equipment, making sure that the ground around the trees is clear of debris. If we have like winter storms that cause trees to come down, going ahead and removing those out of the orchard. If we are planting trees, if you're somebody who is planting new trees, we're going to be doing that around January, February, and then we're going to be doing our pruning of whatever young trees we have as well. This is where we're going to be doing our fertility, so soil testing, lime, and applying our zinc, phosphorus, magnesium, and potassium if needed. As I said, if you were kind of following our pre-program one, we would say wait till March, and that's when we would really worry about our fertility. And then from weeds and pests standpoint, if you do have young trees, we do recommend scouting and trapping for ambrosia beetles specifically, and we would set those up in early February. And March and April, again, kind of just maintain your orchard however you need to. If you did not do all of your pruning and training early on, this is also a time of year where we can still do that work. This is when we're going to recommend kind of that blanket fertility application. And then this is also when we start thinking about weed management within our orchard. Now, from a backyard or homeowner standpoint, you may not care as much about that, but a lot of times in a commercial sense, they try to maintain under the pecan trees free of most plant matter, just because it helps with making sure that the fertility and the water are actually going into the pecan trees and not feeding something they don't want it to. If you have real specific weeds in that orchard you want to get rid of, I recommend working with your county agent to identify those and get a herbicide recommendation for managing those. If you want to do some maybe inter-tree grazing, like that might be an option. If you've got livestock, you can allow your livestock to graze in your pecan orchard during this time of year. I've seen some really cool things with clover used in pecan orchards to help return some nitrogen back to the soil. So there's some cool options there that we can talk about. I'm not going to go in depth with that here, but just thinking about kind of what does the orchard management and the between row management look like for your specific setup. In May and June, again, we're starting to look at mowing, so hopefully we do have some grass or clover or whatever we have between our trees starting to come in, so we do want to make sure that we're mowing that and taking care of it. We're going to have the first and second nut drop. Remember I mentioned that. That's completely normal. We see that this time of year. If you have good crop on your tree, right, so if you have a good load of pecans on those trees, this is when we would recommend you apply your second batch of nitrogen. Typically, we recommend that you do 3 applications. So when you soil test, you take that annual nitrogen recommendation and you split it in 3 and you provide it throughout the growing season. The reason for that is that nitrogen leaches out of our soil really quickly. So if we apply it all at once at the start of the season, it doesn't necessarily benefit the trees after you get a couple of good rainfalls. So splitting it into multiple applications can be helpful. And then, as I said, just weed management on whatever you have problems with. In July and August, this is again just kind of general orchard maintenance. We're going to have our third nut drop. So this is the third time you're going to see nuts leave the tree. If you have a really heavy nut load, you could consider trying to thin it. Again, your ability to do that is going to be really limited as a homeowner or backyard pecan producer, but it is something that if you would like to do that, this would be the time. This is also when we do some of that leaf tissue sampling to determine the fertility of that tree. Again, if you've got a lot of heavy nut load, go ahead and add more nitrogen. If you don't have a heavy crop on those trees, don't add more nitrogen. It's an expense that you're not going to recoup. And again, herbicides as needed. In September and October, this is when we're working on starting our harvest. So we're going to work on harvesting our nuts. If you're trying to sell, whether that's locally or maybe you're working with some local stores, just selling off your home front or something like that, start thinking about how you're going to market and package and sell those nuts. And again, we still may have some herbicide needed for target weeds. A lot of weed management can also just be mowing. So making sure that you're mowing pretty regularly. As we start getting through September to November-ish when we're harvesting, I recommend you stop mowing so you don't mow over all of your nuts. But the rest of the season, mowing is a great tool to help reduce some of that weed pressure. Then in November and December, again, we're harvesting as frequently as we can. We are going to be marketing that pecan crop if you're selling it, or you can just keep it and harvest and store it like we talked about. If you have orchards where you've got trees that are clearly in decline and need to be removed, this is the time to do it. Again, making sure your equipment is in working order, making sure you're prepared if you're planting any new trees, doing some site preparation, and then again, based on that tissue sample back in kind of September, October, if you need zinc, go ahead and apply it now. And so that is going to bring you a full cycle back to the January and February. And again, I'll make sure that you get a copy of this so that you have it handy. So all of that, hopefully that it was relatively helpful. I hate to say there's a lot of limitations for backyard pecans just because we often don't have the equipment that we need to do a lot of the things that would really benefit the trees. But I would say if you can get on top of your fertility, if you get better at scouting for disease and insects, those are going to really be the best things you can do to help improve the pecan trees that you have. So I'm going to stop. If there's any questions, I'm happy to help answer them or try to answer them. And if you guys ever need anything from me related to pecans, let me know.
Thank you so much, Robyn.